Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. This week, we're talking about why Quartz launched a standalone newsletter that dives into obscure trivia. Would you read a 1,300-word newsletter about garden sheds? What about a 1,400-word piece on lettuce? A little over a year ago, the business-focused publication Quartz made a bet that you would, launching a daily newsletter called Quartz Obsession. The aim of the product? Take the most mundane topics imaginable and, through narration, numbers, and quotes, prove to the reader that these topics are not mundane at all. Unlike many publication newsletters that simply round up links to articles on the publication's site, Quartz Obsession is a standalone newsletter that can be completely consumed within the inbox. It's seen open rates as high as 80%, and thousands of readers have written in to suggest topics. Why did Quartz launch a product that steered clear of the editorial topics it usually covers on its website? And how does it pick each day's topics? To answer these questions, I turned to Jess-Ann Collins, who edits the newsletter. Let's jump right into it. Hey, Jess-Ann, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you now work at Quartz, specifically heading up a newsletter project called Quartz Obsession. How did you end up with that job?
Well, I took kind of a roundabout path to working in the newsletter sphere, which began with working in print magazines. So I spent about 10 years in the magazine industry. Most recently, I was editor-in-chief of a magazine called Mental Floss, which is a quirky sort of knowledge and trivia-based magazine, general interest. So it's quite similar to the Quartz Obsession in certain ways in its DNA.
Yeah, it goes deep on like certain like random topics that aren't really tied to the news cycle, if I remember correctly.
Not at all news oriented, more about the exploration of interesting topics and interesting rabbit holes. So I spent 6 years there prior to joining Quartz. The magazine actually no longer exists. The website still exists, but the magazine folded in 2016. And eventually at that point, I was just kind of looking around for new opportunities. And what I was specifically interested in doing, with this background in print magazines, where my specialty was really packaging and sort of nonlinear storytelling, kind of coming at stories from a way that combined narrative and graphics and other sorts of nonlinear perspectives. I was looking for a role that was product specific. I wanted to work on a digital product that had storytelling at its core, but was really also about connecting directly with an audience, because that was something that coming from the print world was very key to my background, as an editor, and the reason that I think people were still subscribing to magazines and do still subscribe to magazines is because they feel a really strong connection with the product. So when I started exploring, the varieties of ways that products were manifesting online, I stumbled into the Quartz rabbit hole. And Quartz obviously has been kind of a leader in developing all kinds of different interesting news-based products. So they were actually looking for an editor to head up this new newsletter product called The Obsession. There was a concept of it that it would be a daily deep dive into a single topic and kind of come at the news from this askance angle and use a multimedia format to tell that story. And I was like, hey, that's me. So I joined Quartz about 6 months before the product launched, and I had that time to kind of iterate on what it was going to look like and how it was going to work every day and what elements were going to be the core part of it. And I also worked at that time on our other push team products, the Quartz Daily Brief, which is our flagship daily newsletter, and the Quartz app, which is a news app that delivers the news kind of throughout the day.
So they knew kind of like a basic concept, but it was up to you to kind of shape the structure of what this thing was going to look like.
Yeah, the concept came from a product designer at Quartz who really, had this idea that at Quartz, which is a broad multi interest organization with journalists who are working on all kinds of interesting areas of inquiry. There was this kind of like interesting back channel Slack conversation thing going on where people would just kind of go down these interesting rabbit holes. And one of his thoughts with this product was like, we need a way to sort of turn that spirit of inquiry outward to our public, and kind of take them along with us on this research journey. So he came up with the idea to do this email around a single topic and to have it be told in this multimedia card-based way. So the product, architecture where it's built around a series of cards that each one does a different thing was in that concept. And then from there, it was kind of up to me and my team to sort of iterate around what we would have each card do, how we would tell a coherent story that was navigable, but also eclectic enough to kind of keep people's interest, but keep them surprised and compelled all the way through. So that took a fair bit of experimenting with, I think, to kind of find the right elements and the right length and the sort of gritty details like that.
I remember when Quartz first launched, I don't know if it still is this, but they had this messaging that their reporters didn't cover beats, they covered obsessions. Does this have something to do with why it ended up being called Obsession, the newsletter?
Yeah, it does. So the idea of obsession as a concept is very core to Quartz's original mission. And you're right. The way that we think about the areas that we cover is in terms of evolving obsessions rather than kind of standard beats. So if a standard beat is like the tech industry, Quartz is looking at things from a more interdisciplinary approach and sort of at the way things are changing over time. So an example of an obsession versus a beat might be like the future of food or machines with brains. So it's kind of a more focused, multidisciplinary area of inquiry to follow. So when we were launching the Obsession email, it was in part, a way to kind of double down on that concept as an organizing principle, and it was also kind of a way to experiment, with the way that obsession can play out kind of in a micro level. So I think about the Obsession email almost as being like the fine, detailed iteration of what an obsession might be, and the way that Quartz covers obsessions on the site overall as being a little bit more of a macro perspective, if that makes sense.
So there are two different kinds of newsletters. Like there's those that are basically summaries of content that can that you can find on the news site that you click away from the newsletter to the individual articles. And there are newsletters that are self-contained. They don't require you to click out of them. All the content is within the newsletter itself. Why did they decide that make this a newsletter product and not just a regular feature on the website? I mean, I know there is like a web component, like a web version of it, but it seems like the main way that you want people to consume this usually is just by reading it in their inbox.
Yeah, Quartz feels very strongly that you create the product for the platform that you're serving it to. So it very much is designed to be something that's consumable, right in the inbox. I like to think a little bit of it as the way I sort of tell the story as a little bit of a choose your own adventure style, meaning like the email is set up so that you can read it from start to finish without leaving your inbox and get something out of it. You can also click on all the links and leave your inbox and get much, much deeper into this topic. Or you can actually just, and I, anecdotally, I hear from people that they like it because you can skim around and kind of pick and choose what aspects of it you're interested in reading. So you can go a little bit lighter. And I think that's one of the reasons that people have really responded to it and connected with it. but yeah, at its core, it's really, we wanted to experiment with what we could do within the boundaries of the inbox and really push the bar on that a little bit, because we're big believers in just delivering content to people where they already are. And we know that despite being kind of an antique technology at this point, like email hasn't gone anywhere. And if anything, people are as reliant on it as ever. Um, it was definitely core to the concept that it was an email newsletter, and in some ways, the limitations, like any kind of designer or like creative team will tell you that like the limitations on a project is the sort of fun part. So email as a platform is, frustrating because it's quite limited what you can actually do. It's also changing all the time. Like Gmail, every time Gmail updates its system, things start to break. And so it needs kind of constant maintenance from a product perspective. But that said, I think our team was really inspired by the idea of working within this kind of known space and creating something that, people really hadn't seen there before. And all that said, now that we've been doing the obsession for a year and it's kind of established itself as an editorial product and, a sort of very specific thing in that space, I think we don't see the limit to it as being email. Like it is an email right now, but I think we're starting to think about it as something that has legs that can extend um, into other mediums and other dimensions. So we're just at the beginning phases of thinking about what those might be and how it might translate to other mediums.
Well, you mentioned you use the word multimedia. Like, is it mainly just a newsletter at this point, or are you guys making other kind of tangential media around it?
It is just a newsletter at this point. We've kind of made a whole bunch of tangential products out of it in our minds and in our brainstorming sessions. So we have big, ideas about different ways it can go. At this point, it's still just a newsletter. It does live on the site as well, and we're working on ways to sort of make that more discoverable and more navigable. One of the things, about the email is that it's kind of got light news pegs, but a lot of what we're covering is quite evergreen. So knowing that we've amassed this quantity of stories about things that are kind of not going away anytime soon, we're really thinking hard and starting to experiment with what we might do with those archives and stuff like that.
What are the day-to-day operations for the newsletter? Like how do you choose the topics? What kind of reporting resources do you have at your disposal? Can anyone at Quartz contribute to it if there's something that they're interested in? And maybe this will give you a chance. Like, I should have started with this. To give the listeners give us examples of different things. So you guys you guys will pick some kind of topic. A lot of times it'll be sometimes like a completely mundane topic, and like the kind of topic where people would be like, well, why would I want to know about that? And then you go really deep on it and explain why it's interesting and pull up all kinds of trivia about it and stuff like that. So like, tell me about how you pick these topics and how you basically will build an issue from start to finish.
Yeah, so one of the fears that we had when we started this was that we were going to run out of topics doing this every single day. We were like, can there really be that many topics in the world? As it turns out, very quickly, we realized that we had the opposite problem. It's like once you start kind of looking at the world and the news with this lens on about where the sort of quirky stories live in small places that you might otherwise overlook, we realize that they're just everywhere. So 95% of the time, the topics that we're assigning are coming from, the kind of just watchful eyes of myself and the other team members, the other Quartz reporters, who are we literally just all ping ideas into a Slack channel, and it's just overflowing. Like they're just constantly, items in there. And I think the trick is in finding the right level of specificity, and part of what we've toyed with is how, where that ideal level is. It's almost like a long read. People will say that it's almost like a long read, but it doesn't feel like a long read because it's told in this PC way. That said, it's not.
Yeah, you break it up into segments. You'll have like statistics, like a whole series of numbers thrown in. You'll have like pull quotes. Like it's not like they're just reading one long article.
Yeah, it's like we'll use numbers or timelines to tell a little history in a quick way. A quote, a GIF, a chart, quiz, which contains actual information, so stuff like that. So they have this sense of being quite sprawling, but they're actually, they're like in the 1,500 word range maybe. So they're not in. It's not a small amount of content, I guess, but they're also not huge. So I think the trick is in finding the thing that you can tell, that you can kind of do justice to in that amount of space, in a really thorough way, or an angle to a story that you're telling about a much bigger thing that you can kind of follow the narrative thread through. Like we're not trying to literally be another Wikipedia and tell you everything about this topic. We're telling you kind of what's interesting and important about it and why it matters, now and to you. So it's a pretty curated experience. So, I guess a good example of something that we did recently that I really loved is the topic with sheds, like garden sheds, which sounds like the most kind of inane thing. Like, what could there possibly be to say about the little place in the backyard where you keep the garden tools? But there was actually this really interesting narrative to it about how in, I think it's Australia, sheds were actually becoming this really important gathering place for this like class of like retired men who otherwise were suffering from like depression and loneliness, and they sort of found this place of meaning and community gathering in their backyard sheds. So we kind of looked at the way that like this kind of humble piece of architecture was really like playing out in this modern cultural problem. So I think finding the unexpected angles is something that's really important and key to the storytelling that we're doing. Also, just finding the unexpected details and the really sort of interesting little tidbits that you kind of really do have to dig for sometimes. I always want people to feel a bit surprised by what they're reading. So I think that's how, as long as we can compel people to open an email with a subject line like sheds, my promise is that it's going to be more interesting than you thought it would be. And that's, I think, what people have really responded to.
And how do you promote the newsletter? Like, what do you see leads to the most signups? Like, is it people just passing it along, forwarding it to other people, or is it coming? Are they mainly coming in through the web version? Like, how do you like? Obviously, newsletters don't go viral a lot of the time because they're kind of designed not to, since they're sitting in inboxes. How do you grow a newsletter like this?
Yeah, it really has been to date an extremely organic process. We haven't really invested a ton of time or money at all into growing it on purpose. We obviously share it on our site and kind of cross promote with our other products. But really what has driven, the reach of it has been people sharing it with other people. And we do have, sort of data on that, which individual ones get shared the most, we can kind of gauge like the success of certain topics based off that, or that's one of the kind of slightly more qualitative measures numbers that we use to kind of think about which were the most successful. But just anecdotally, I think we just, it's the kind of thing that people discover and then feel like they really discovered something unique and special, and they feel like they want to evangelize for it. So that's really done us well to just be a product that people really love and kind of want to share.
And even though they aren't, most of them aren't tied to the news cycle, it seems like some of them are. Like you had one on Aretha Franklin when she died. I think you had one around Mr. Rogers right around when that documentary was getting a lot of press. Do those newsletters tend to have a higher open rates? Like, are you noticing something different with those ones that are actually tied to the news cycle?
Yeah, that's a good question that we kind of always ask ourselves. Like how newsy is, what's the right level of newsiness, and what's the right level of being kind of irreverent and a little outside the news, because maybe people are tired of hearing about the same topics over and over. I don't know that we have a magic formula for it. I think, the topics they're pretty hard to predict analytically, like what will be a hit or not. They're easier, and this isn't scientific, but it's easier just to kind of know that a thing is like the thing of the day and feels like the zeitgeist. So it's kind of a I guess like editorial instinct more than a quantitative recipe. But yeah, like the Mr. Rogers one did amazing. Aretha Franklin did really well. Other ones that have done, kind of outstanding lately. I mean, CBD was a big topic over the summer that did really well, just in the news all the time. The way that the marijuana industry is, the cannabis industry is, kind of reorganizing right now. But it wasn't like necessarily in the news that week. Or another one that did really amazingly recently was olive oil, which there is a news story about, it's kind of ambiently in the news, but it's not like there was like a day that the olive oil story blew out. So it can be quite hard, I think, to predict performance other than just by like a gut instinct that this is kind of what people want to read about today.
So there are a couple of publications like yours that kind of try to pick a kind of a quote unquote boring topic and then surprise readers by showing them that it's actually interesting. There's an interesting newsletter called Tedium that does that. There was a Gimlet, or I don't know if it's still on, but there was a Gimlet show that was called Surprisingly Awesome, and then they renamed it to something else. I'd imagine that the web versions of the newsletters, like they're like super detailed Wikipedia articles in some way, because like I'm sure there's a Wikipedia article on sheds, but it's not going to have all the information that you share. And I imagine that like the web versions of your newsletter do really good with search engines. Like, have you found that to be the case?
They should be. Yeah. I think there's a real potential for them to be really great long-term traffic drivers for, just for like almost exactly what you're saying. Like we're covering this Wikipedia's worth of topics. Yeah, they should be.
Mm-hmm. And so, and then like, what kind of actions are you trying to get from people? Like, what kind of prompts do you have? Like, obviously you want people to sign up. What other things are you like doing to engage your community?
Yeah, we love to think about our community and try to experiment with it a lot. One thing that we have been doing from the beginning, or close to the beginning, is letting people reply right to the email and asking them to, so giving them a lot of prompts and sort of, posing queries that will prompt them to reply. And we get those in an inbox, and I look at it. We ask people, what should we cover? And people write in with just the best ideas. Like it's almost like as if we didn't have an overflowing, Slack channel ourselves, or the readers could literally just write the whole, or at least write the editorial calendar for a year, because they just have so many great suggestions. One thing we've done recently, because I feel like it's just this amazing gift to have this inbox full of friendly emails and accolades and ideas for myself. But one thing we've been experimenting with lately is we created a subreddit over the summer with the idea that if we could encourage some of that same level of interaction in a public forum, we could grow this community into one that was kind of enabling these obsession readers to connect with each other and kind of explore these topic areas that they're interested in a kind of community setting. It's been a bit of a slow burn, to be honest, and I feel like we haven't quite had the bandwidth to give it the editorial push that it probably needs to really take off. But we have a couple hundred users on there that we're not trying to break into the general Reddit scene. There's certainly subreddits that do this type of thing much better. But we really wanted to just create a very specific place for if you're an obsession reader and you want to talk about sheds today, come to this thread on this subreddit. So that's one way we've just begun to toy with the possibilities of kind of connecting the readers into a community.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of publications are focusing on Facebook groups now. Vox has some good newsletters. They have a good healthcare newsletter, and they have a Facebook group to go into it, and it's a self-sustained community of people who are interested in healthcare policy, and they post to it pretty often. I know that Reddit is trying to court publications. I know Washington Post has its own subreddit, and they're actually kind of monitoring that community. Do you find it has enough volume to where it makes it worth your time?
I feel like we haven't given enough of a shot yet, to be honest. The volume is not there at this time, but I also feel like it's a two-way street. I feel like I haven't given it enough time to really feel like I should, have gotten to that point yet. So it's definitely something I want to experiment with more and kind of dive into more than as I've been able.
Mm-hmm. And so I know that you don't work on the business side; you're on the editorial side. Can you talk a little bit about how it's monetized?
Yeah. So it's there are sponsorship opportunities for it. Basically, there'll be ads in the email. They are designed to kind of seamlessly. They look like ads, but they're done in this sort of same card, graphic card style that we use throughout the email. So they feel kind of a kind, non-intrusive. But so you'll see this email was sponsored by so and so, and so just like any kind of editorial, real estate, it's kind of an option for when the sales team is selling sponsorships.
Mm-hmm. So it doesn't really interweave with the editorial at all?
No, it doesn't interweave with the editorial. There's care taken, obviously, that the sponsorship makes sense with the subject area. So we have certain, topics that are obviously science or tech or business, or lifestyle. So the sponsor would slot into a place that makes sense for them to appear. But there's no kind of weaving editorial around who the sponsor is or anything like that. It's very, very quite church state, actually.
So it seems, last question, it seems like a lot of publications, they're getting into the newsletter space. I was just thinking the other day that I really need to cull through the newsletters I'm reading every day, because it's taking up too much of my morning. And it's especially so now that I think since Facebook has announced that they're backing away from news. So a lot of these publications are trying to really diversify their traffic and branch out on more platforms, and they're seeing emails as one of the last great platforms that aren't really affected by algorithms and that are somewhat platform agnostic. Do you think the inbox is getting to be a more competitive space to be in? I don't know if you've seen any kind of fluctuations in how hard it is to get new signups or open rates or anything like that. Is now that everybody is launching a newsletter is like, because like the thing we always heard about newsletters is like that their engagement rate in terms of opens is so much higher than Twitter or Facebook, whereas like on Twitter and Facebook you're lucky if like 5% of your audience sees it, whereas like a newsletter, it's like not incredibly uncommon to have as high as like a 40 or 50% open rate, which you just never see on something like Twitter or Facebook. What are your thoughts on this as more and more publications get into this space?
Yeah, I mean, I feel a little bit fortunate in this regard because I think that the Obsession is doing something pretty unique and distinct, and that our offering is always going to be pretty clear. I mean, hopefully that nobody takes the idea and launches a competitor and then does it 8 times better. That could always happen. But definitely I can see just from a pure kind of bandwidth perspective, there's certainly more inventory on the table than there was a while ago. I don't know. I mean, I tend to think that there may at some point be kind of a culling of the newsletters when, I think if organizations are launching newsletters thinking like, this is just a thing that we can do on the side, and everybody's doing it, so like let's throw a bunch of links in an email and send it out. Certainly, like I would say the landscape is much more competitive of that, but I do think the ones that are kind of invested in and are connecting in the right way with the right audiences are, I'm not that worried about the longevity of them. I think email has proved to be so, oddly enduring for exactly that reason. It's like the space on the internet that you can control and that you can kind of really curate as much as you want. So as long as you're doing something that people want to have in their worlds, that's the hard part and the magic equation. I feel okay about the prospects there.
Okay, Jessanne, those were all the questions I had. Where can people find you online?
So the best way to find us online is to go to qz.com and click on emails at the top right-hand corner of the page, and you'll see Quartz Obsession right there.
Awesome. Well, this was a lot of fun. Thanks so much. Okay, that's all we have for you today. Be sure to subscribe to the Business of Content on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. See you next week.